Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another virtual legal clinic, Know Your Rights, the tax edition. With everything taking place during the pandemic, we wanted to ensure that our families were able to ask questions and get some expert advice as they prepare for the upcoming tax season. I'm Jelena Small, with the director of our parent and family engagement programs at CS Buffalo in partnership with the community schools work, and happy to introduce my colleague. Emily Alvarez, who is our CS Legal Clinic coordinator, who will be introducing our presenter for today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's Know Your Rights session. I will be presenting today's speaker, one of our attorneys, Zara Saleh. Zara is our qualified tax expert as part of VLP's Low Income Taxpayer Clinic. She joined VLP in November 2019, where her practice was focused on representing taxpayers with federal tax disputes, as well as conducting outreach and education events throughout the community. Zara is a graduate of the University of Nebraska College of Law and completed her undergraduate degree from York University in Toronto, Canada. Thank you, Zara, for today's presentation, and I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, Emily and Jelena. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today for our Know Your Rights, the Tax Edition presentation. As Emily mentioned, my name is Zara, and I'm the qualified tax expert, also known as the staff attorney working in the Low Income Taxpayer Clinic with VLP. As Emily mentioned, in this role, I provide representation to taxpayers with disputes with the IRS. Our clinic also conducts education and outreach events throughout the community with the goal of increasing taxpayer awareness of the U.S. tax system and their rights and responsibilities as U.S. taxpayers. I do also want to add that in that process, we also hope to hear from taxpayers about some of the concerns that they've had interacting with the tax system, whether that be on the federal level or on the state level. I know that this year was particularly trying, especially with the stimulus checks going out. And I know that a lot of people were facing a lot of difficulties in actually receiving the stimulus checks. So another part of our goal really is to hear from you about the issues that you're facing so that we can address them one-on-one, but also act as an advocate and hopefully address these issues on a systemic level as well. So I just want to go over our agenda for today. So I want to begin by talking about the LITC. So I'm going to refer to our clinic as the LITC for short going forward, but it is the Taxpayer Clinic. We're going to discuss some tax filing basics. I want to highlight the difference between refundable versus non-refundable credits and why that's important. We're going to discuss relief from joint and several liability, as well as injured spouse and the allocation of a joint refund. We're going to end off by discussing collection alternatives. So if you owe a tax debt that you're unable to pay, what options do you have to settle that tax debt based on your ability to pay? It does say that the final section is reserved for questions, but I want to encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. I think it might be easier to address them while you might forget about them towards the end, but regardless, please feel free to ask throughout the presentation or at the end of the presentation, whichever you prefer. Okay, so about the LITC. So the LITC program was created by statute in 1998. This really came about by the recognition that there was a void in the provision of legal services to the low-income population. This applies to civil legal services in general, but it became apparent that tax and disputes with the IRS was no exception to that issue. So in 1998, Congress enacted the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act, and statute 7526, subsection 7526 authorizes the use of dollar for dollar matching grants to be used for the LITC program. The goal of the program is to protect taxpayer rights by providing access to representation for low-income taxpayers. One thing that was noted is that, there's actually a statistic that a represented individual is 2 times as likely to obtain a correct outcome in a dispute with the IRS. And so really the goal is that the program doesn't want the ability to obtain a correct outcome to be dependent on someone's ability to pay for representation. So they decided that this was deserving. And so if you qualify for our services, we will represent you free of charge, except for, sorry, I apologize, if there's any filing fees, but usually there is also an exception for low-income taxpayers that will exempt you from the filing fee. So in terms of the work we do, I just want to highlight before I talk about the work that we do is that this is not an exhaustive list, but most of our work focuses on offers in compromise. So that's a negotiation or a settlement of a tax debt. We represent taxpayers who are under audit, so that can be for different credits. The most common is the earned income tax credit, claiming dependents, filing statuses. We also assist with injured and innocent spouse claims, worker classification. We assist with the removal of levies and liens, as well as identity theft. So if you are a victim of identity theft involving your tax return, your income, or your refund claims, please do reach out to our office. We can offer assistance on the steps you should take to ensure that your rights are protected. As I mentioned, this is not an exhaustive list. So if you do find yourself facing a question, you're not really sure, you've had a change of circumstance and you don't really know how this is going to impact your tax situation, please feel free to give us a call. We do provide consultations as well, and we don't bite, I promise. So please give us a call. We're more than happy to help. So I'm going to move on to tax filing basics. The first thing I want to talk about is filing status. So your filing status is very important because it is really central to determining whether you need to file a tax return or not, how much your standard deduction will be if you choose to take the standard deduction, and ultimately the amount of tax that you will owe. So the different filing statuses are single, married filing jointly, married filing separately, head of household, and qualifying widower. That kind of just sounds like different, I'm just throwing out different words, but there are different factors that will determine what your filing status is. Ultimately, it's really based on your age, your marital status, and whether or not you have dependents. It's important to note that your filing status is determined on the last day of the tax year. So if you got married December 1st, if you got married December 1st, 2020, when you file your tax returns, which will be in January 2021, you will have to use either married filing separately or married filing jointly, because as of December 31st, you were married. Similarly, if you had a child born January 5th, 2021, even though you're going to be filing your taxes after the child was born, you would not be able to claim them for your 2020 taxes. So just be cognizant of the fact that your filing status is determined as of the last day of your tax year. So for this year, that'll be December 31st, 2020.
Hey, Zara, we do have a couple of questions coming in related to this topic, and I don't want to miss them.
Awesome.
So one question that came from our Facebook viewers is, we won't be able to file taxes because we haven't worked this year. So as you mentioned, they would use prior year tax information, even though if they haven't worked this year, correct?
So your tax filing obligation depends on the tax year. So if you had, I'm assuming, if you do you know if that individual received unemployment or?
I can pose that question to them. Can you elaborate a little bit regarding the unemployment piece for those that didn't work?
Of course. So that was actually a point that I was going to bring up. So unemployment is taxable. And I know that unfortunately that was the reality of many individuals this year. So your information the information that you use to file your tax return is based on what happened during that tax year. So for 2020, you're going to be using the information that occurred strictly in 2020. So if you were married or if you received income in 2020, that's the information that you would receive. That's the information that you would use. There's actually also specific forms for each tax year. So the changes are usually very small, but that can lead to an issue. So you should only use the information for the tax year that you're filing for. I hope that addresses your question. I'm not sure, but if you didn't receive income, I'm going to address that also further in the presentation. Some people choose to not file a tax return if they don't have any income. Depending on your situation, if your spouse had income, it might be wise to file a tax return. But yeah, it is really based on the information for the tax year. Unemployment, the reason I wanted to highlight unemployment is because a lot of people might not be aware of this, but unemployment is actually taxable. And you might not receive, I believe the form is 1099G. So if you've received unemployment, you should obtain a 1099G from it's New York State, and that will have all of the information of how much money you received, how much was withheld, and that's what you would use to file your taxes for this year. So if you fall into that bucket of you were not employed, you didn't receive income, but you did receive unemployment, that does count as taxable income, and that's what you would use.
All right, and then one additional question for individuals who live in the same household as their parents but have a child of their own that are under the age of 18, what is their filing status?
So that would really depend on whether the individual is working. So you can live in the same household. Now, it depends. I mean, are your parents going to be filing a tax return? Is it just you who's filing a tax return? And there's different ways to go about that. So if you're the primary breadwinner and you're working, and your parents aren't working, you could possibly claim them. And your children, sorry, no, you wouldn't claim them, you would claim your children. But if your parents, so your children would be your dependents ultimately. I mean, if you're working, your children would be your dependents. There's it's really difficult because it's a case-by-case scenario, but I guess I'll just highlight the tests that determine whether you can claim the dependents. So it's age, residence, a joint return test, and the income. So to claim a dependent, really the test is that that the person that you're claiming did not provide more than half of their own income. So if they provide more than half of their own income, then you can't claim them. But if they're living with you, then you would be able to claim them, and they have to be younger than you. So they have to be age 19 or below, or if they're a full-time student, they can be 24 or below. You have to live in the same residence. Usually, I mean, your parents could claim you, and your parents could claim your children if the situation permits. It's difficult to analyze that again, because it depends on the answer to the other tests. But that's really what we're looking for. Sorry, I don't know if I mean, please feel free to reach out to our office. I mean, I can answer that on one-on-one. I think that might be a bit more appropriate. But that's generally what the tests are. So, age, residence, a joint return test, income, and they have to be residents in the US. So
Thanks, Zara.
you sorry. So your tax filing obligation, as I mentioned, your filing status has a lot to do with whether or not you actually need to file a tax return. So this table highlights the different filing statuses. I'm going to, for the example, I'm going to stick to one demographic, which is under the age of 65, just because it makes comparing it a little bit easier. So if you were single at the end of the tax year and you were under the age of 65, if your income was $12,200 or below, then you are not obligated to file a tax return. Versus if you were married filing jointly and your joint income was below $24,400, then you don't need to file a tax return. So you can see how the threshold is a little bit higher for married filing jointly. Interestingly, married filing separately is very low. It's $5. So if you are married, but you have chosen to file your tax return separately from your spouse, or you have chosen to not file jointly, if your income is $5 or above, then you do have a filing requirement. That might not seem like a big deal, but how does your filing status impact the amount of tax that you pay? This is where things get a little bit interesting. So this table was taken from the Tax Foundation, and it breaks down the tax rate by filing status. It does not include all of the filing statuses, but I will say that it includes the information for filing statuses that have a material change. So if you are single, or if you're using married filing separately, your tax information is going to be in that first column. If you are filing jointly, it'll be in the second column, and head of household is in that last column. So in order, just to count, so head of households, you have to be single and you have to be able to claim a dependent in order to use head of household status. Married filing jointly is you have to be married and you have to agree with your spouse that you're going to file jointly. And single is you're unmarried at the end of the tax year, or if you're using married filing separately, you're married, but you and your spouse have chosen to file your taxes separately. So this is, and I say it's interesting because it, you can see that married filing jointly will usually get a favorable tax treatment. So if we look at the numbers, if you're single or using married filing separately, your income up to $9,700 will be taxed at 10%. Versus if you use married filing jointly, you have almost an extra $10,000 that's going to be taxed at that 10%. So for example, just to kind of bring it home, the difference between $9,400, for simplicity's sake, let's say it's a $10,000 difference. That $10,000, if you're using married filing jointly, will be taxed at 10% rather than 12%. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it does add up. So usually married filing jointly, in most circumstances, will be the better option for married individuals. We're going to discuss a little bit more in further detail further in the presentation, some situations where that might not be favorable, but just for the general rule, it's usually better to use the married filing jointly filing status. Sorry, I see something in the chat box. Okay, just bear with me while
I can read the question for you, Zara.
Thank
So
you.
it says, what if you're taking care of other family members? How would you file for that?
So if they would have to, you could still claim them as dependent, but in this case, they wouldn't be a qualifying child. They would be a qualifying relative. And that, I believe, it could be your parents, your siblings, your parents, your siblings, or any descendants thereof. So you could claim them if they meet the qualifying relative test. And we've seen that a lot. I mean, I've seen a lot of siblings claim you still have to be older than them, I believe, to use the qualifying relative. Actually, no, sorry. Let me digress. Okay, let me digress. So if you could claim somebody that a family member if they meet the qualifying relative test. And no, you don't have, because you can also claim your parents. And there's actually an exception that even if your parents don't live with you, but you provide more than half their support, you could also claim them as dependents. So there are tests for that as well. Again, I can't tell you completely whether or not you can claim them, because again, it's a facts and circumstances analysis, and we have to go through each test separately. But we can definitely do that if you'd like to reach out to our office. But that's the general rule. Are there any other questions? Sorry, before you.
Not as of yet.
I don't know where my chat box. Oh, now it comes up. Okay, sorry. Let me see. Okay, I'll keep that. So what if your income is lower than the filing requirement? Should you file a tax return anyways? In many cases, yes. So consider the following situations. If you're a wage earner and you have had income tax withheld from your paycheck, filing a tax return gives you an opportunity to receive the amount that you had overpaid, that you had over withheld throughout the tax year. Similarly, if you are self-employed and you've been making estimated tax payments throughout the year, and you've overpaid, then you can also get that money back in the form of a refund. And this is my personal favorite. You might be eligible for refundable credits, which brings me to the difference between non-refundable versus refundable credits. So these are the two types of credits that are available in the tax system. In non-refundable, when we're talking about non-refundable credits, this means that the taxpayer gets a refund only to the extent that they owe money. So you will not be issued a refund for these credits. So one example of these credits is the mortgage interest credit. And let's say that you owe, you're filing your taxes and it says your tax liability is $300, but you're eligible for the mortgage interest credit in the amount of $500. So you have a $300 liability, and a $500 mortgage interest credit. What that mortgage interest credit will do is it will reduce your tax liability to zero, but you will not get that additional $200 back. Still great. I mean, I definitely still think, I think that you should claim them if you qualify. But refundable credits are really the superstar, because with refundable credits, the taxpayer is actually issued a refund for the amount that the credit exceeds the tax liability. So if we're using the same numbers, the earned income tax credit is one of the central refundable credits. And so we're going to use the same number. So let's say that you have a $300 tax liability, but you're eligible for the earned income tax credit in the amount of $500. Again, this is just for simplicity's sake. Your tax liability will be reduced to zero, and you will also get $200 back. This is really important because, and this is why I say sometimes there is a reason for you to file a tax return, even if you don't have that obligation. If you have earned income and you're eligible for the earned income tax credit, you need to file a tax return to claim it. So it's really a great incentive to file a tax return if you fall into that situation. So that brings me to the earned income tax credit. This is the largest needs-tested anti-poverty cash entitlement program. Unfortunately, 25%, I believe that the statistic is 25% of eligible individuals do not actually claim the credit because they don't know, they're not aware that they're eligible, or they're not aware that you actually have to file a tax return and claim the credit in order to receive it. So as the slide says, to be eligible, you have to file an income tax return, and you must meet other requirements such as having a social security number valid for employment. You cannot be the qualifying child of another filer, and you have to have earned income. So one really useful tool is publication 5334. The IRS actually has a lot of useful tools that help you determine whether or not you're eligible for something. Sorry, my screen is playing games on me. But I do want to pull up publication 5334 just to show you what it really does. So this really goes through all of the tests for the earned income tax credit. And it takes you, it almost is let me move my words. But it takes you step by step through the analysis of whether or not you can claim the earned income tax credit. And also, as you go through the different steps, so I'll just start with, where is this? Do you have a social security number? Is your filing status married, filing jointly, head of household, qualifying widow or single? There's a, I mean, again, this is why I say it's easier to do on a one-on-one because there are a lot of specific tests. But most, if you go through the questions, you can determine generally, I mean, how much you are entitled to through the earned income tax credit. So towards the end, it actually asks if you have one child, two children, or three or more, and how much you can expect to get back. I will say, I mean, this can be really overwhelming. I understand that it is a great tool, but I know that for most taxpayers, it's still very, very overwhelming. So please feel free to reach out to our office. There's also other free tax preparation services in the community, and I'm going to provide some of that information at the end of the presentation. But if you find, if you find yourself, you have children, you have earned income, it sounds like you're probably eligible for this. You don't want to go through all of these tests because, again, some of them are really specific, like are you not claiming a foreign earned income credit? It's just easier, I think, if you have a tax expert in your corner just to clarify and make sure that you actually qualify for this. But again, I mean, if you want to learn a little bit more, this publication is available. Another useful credit is the child tax credit. So this is a credit for individuals who claim an eligible child as a dependent. It is in addition to the credit for child and dependent care expenses and the earned income tax credit. The maximum amount that you can claim is $2,000 for each child. This credit is a little bit funky because it is non-refundable. However, with the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, you might be able to claim the additional child tax credit, which is refundable up to $1,400. So although it's not refundable in and of itself, you could use the additional child tax credit and claim a refundable credit that way. So.
One question, Zara, regarding the child credit for families who access virtual learning centers or other child care during the pandemic. Would that be a qualifying expense under this category?
Yes, I believe so. I know 2020 has had a lot of changes, but it should qualify, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, just okay. So if you may recall, I highlighted the great benefits of using married filing jointly status because it generally will get you a favorable tax rate. But I do have to highlight that using the status does, and I mentioned it lightly. So generally, it is still better to use married filing jointly just because you'll get a favorable tax rate. However, it is important to note that using married filing jointly makes you and your spouse jointly and severally liable for any tax debt owed. It also means that you hold the refund. If you're entitled to a refund, you hold that refund jointly and severally as well. So what that means is that if you owe a tax debt and you've used married filing jointly, the IRS can pick two pockets. It can come after both spouses. Generally, I mean, that usually many couples, I shouldn't say most, but many couples will be okay with that. I mean, it's okay. But you can probably imagine how there are some circumstances where this will be problematic. Similarly, since, as I mentioned, the refund is held jointly and severally. So if your spouse owes any back due child support, any back due federal or state taxes, really any debt that can be captured through the federal offset program, then your portion of the refund can be used and applied towards that debt. Sounds kind of miserable, but there is also a tool available. There are tools available to address these issues. And those tools take the form of innocent and injured spouse claims. So the IRS recognized this, and there are certain provisions in the tax code for the mistakes and the wrongful behavior of another. So you could still use married filing jointly and get relief from that joint and several liability issue, and you can still obtain your portion of the refund. So I'm going to start with innocent spouse claims. So innocent spouse claims provide relief from joint and several liability. That's done through subsection 6015B, C, and F of the tax code. And ultimately what this does is it provides relief from joint and several liability imposed by married filing jointly. And you would file form 8857. So this next slide, there's a lot of text on it, but ultimately innocent spouse, and this again, this just highlights the different situations. The primary difference really is between 6015B and C, because under the separation of liability, you have to have lived apart for a certain period of time in order to claim relief under that avenue. But generally, the general rule for innocent spouse is that you must have filed a joint return and had an understatement of tax that is solely attributable to your spouse's erroneous item. So if your spouse had income that they didn't claim on a tax return and you weren't aware of it, you didn't have any reason to know about this income, then you can claim innocent spouse. I will also say innocent spouse is, so the primary situations where we see it is if there is a divorce action or if there is some domestic abuse and there's a lot of financial control. The non-requesting spouse will usually use, financial control as a means to continue the control after the relationship has ended. But one avenue for relief, for at least on the tax front, is requesting innocent spouse, because in those situations, usually the spouse requesting this relief is not aware of the issues that gave rise to the tax liability. Another situation where it does come up is if one spouse passes away. So if you have filed married filing jointly and one spouse was the primary breadwinner, and God forbid, but unfortunately that spouse passes away, the IRS can still come after the other spouse because they filed jointly, but that spouse can request innocent spouse because they were not aware, the other spouse was primarily responsible for the finances, and they really had no reason to know. Also, as under 6015B, we actually, I do want to note that with innocent spouse relief, the non-requesting spouse will be made aware that you have filed for this relief. So usually with my clients, this hasn't been a deal breaker because ultimately the goal is to get rid of the tax debt, but I think it's important to highlight that. In some situations, it's really not a big deal at all because there are some individuals that are still married, but they want to just separate, even the non-requesting spouse doesn't want their spouse to be held liable for the debt. So they will actually consent to it, and they'll say, yeah, this was actually, I screwed up, I made a mistake, and my spouse should not be held liable. So, I mean, you get different situations, but this is an avenue of relief that applies to most of those situations. Injured spouse relief. So injured spouse relief was actually a big issue this year with the stimulus check. So injured spouse is the claim for relief by individuals whose joint return has been applied against the separate past due debt of their spouse. So as I mentioned, generally, I mean, it'll apply to federal or state taxes or child or spousal support. That's usually where the issues come up. And in order to claim injured spouse, you have to file Form 8379. This form can be submitted as you file your tax return. So if you're aware that your spouse has this outstanding tax debt, you can still file as married filing jointly, but make sure that you submit Form 8379 with your taxes so that the IRS is aware that that debt applies. It was held only by my spouse, and I shouldn't be penalized for their wrongdoings earlier that arose before our marriage. So just make sure to you can file it after you file your tax return, but it's just it will be a lot easier and faster to apply to submit it with your tax return. That way, when the refund is issued, you will get your portion of the refund. You don't have to worry about your refund being applied to the debt, and then you have to wait for it to go back through. So it's just faster to submit it with your tax return. The reason that I say that this was an issue with the stimulus check, as you may recall, when the stimulus check, when the IRS was pumping out the stimulus checks to eligible individuals, it made a point to say that you will receive your stimulus check regardless of whether you owe federal or state taxes. The only exception was if you owe child support. Unfortunately, with the IRS had closed down its offices, it was, people were definitely overworked, and they were pumping out an enormous amount of money in a short period of time. So there was a glitch and there was an error where even people had actually filed for injured spouse. They had submitted their Form 8379, but their stimulus check was still applied to the back to child support. The IRS is still, it's been about 2 months actually that they've tried to correct that error, but it's taking a bit of time. So just hang tight. So we are aware of that issue. If you do fall into that category of people whose stimulus check has been applied to their spouses back through child support, please reach out to our office. We can guide you through what steps you can take to address that issue and receive your portion of the stimulus check. Okay. So the last section that I want to talk about is collection alternatives. So if you're unable to pay the tax that you owe, there are a number of collection alternatives that you may pursue. Really, they fall into currently not collectible status, an installment agreement, or an offer in compromise. Before I talk in more detail about each of these collection alternatives, I just want to give some background information that we use to determine which collection alternative is most suitable. So after a tax liability is assessed, if you have filed a tax return, the IRS has 10 years to collect on that tax debt. So if it's been 10 years and the IRS has not been able to collect that money from you, the debt becomes uncollectible, and the IRS, it just essentially falls off. 10 years sounds like a long time, but actually we do get a lot of people who are nearing the end of that 10 years. And sometimes, we do take that into account when we decide which collection alternative to pursue. I will mention that New York State has longer collection statute end date. Theirs is 20 years, so it's not as great, but I mean, it is something to be aware of. So the first collection alternative is currently not collectible status. And what that does is it stops collection activity. So if you're a wage earner and your wages are being garnished, or if your Social Security or SSDI is being, a portion of it is being used, is being applied to your tax debt, we can request that your account be put into currently not collectible status. And in order to be put into that status, you just have to show that your basic living expenses exceed your income. And therefore it would cause undue hardship for you to, for the IRS to continue collecting against you, and you'd be eligible for currently not collectible status. This is usually just the first form of relief. I mean, if you're really nearing the end of that 10 years, it might be wise to stay in currently not collectible status, because the 10 years will continue, the clock continues to tick on that 10 years. But that's really the only situation where I would say that you should stay in currently not collectible status. The reason for that is because the amount is still owed. It still continues to accrue penalties and interest. And if you file your tax return, you do have to remain in filing compliance. So if you have a filing obligation, you do have to file a tax return. And if you're owed a refund, the IRS will take that refund and apply it to your tax debt. So it's the first step, but it's usually not the end step for us. But it is some form of relief. The second option is an installment agreement. So if you find that you have some ability to pay, but you can't pay off the entire balance, you can enter into an installment agreement. And then my personal favorite is the offer and compromise. So if there's a doubt as to your liability or doubt as to your ability to pay, usually we'll submit an offer and compromise. And I will say that I do feel like the IRS will be inclined usually to accept a lower amount, especially because the amount that you owe usually gets hiked up by the penalties and the interest. But if we submit an offer and compromise, the IRS will consider a lower amount, and we could actually settle the tax debt, which would wipe it off from the books entirely. So if your offer is accepted, you have the option to pay in a lump sum or in a shortened installment agreement. And that would essentially wipe it out completely, which is important because then you don't have to worry about your wages or your income going up. You don't have to worry about transferring assets and things like that. So an offer and compromise is really, I think, the best if we can get one approved. Does anybody have any questions? I feel like I kind of zipped through that.
Just a few other questions are, Zara. One question is, how does tax filing status impact families who have students currently enrolled in college? And how do students currently enrolled in college file on their own if they are working and their parents won't be filing for them?
Okay, so I guess I'll break that down into two. So if your parents are filing tax return, if the parents are filing tax returns and there's a student that is enrolled full-time and they are under the age of 24 years old, then they can claim them as dependents and have the benefits of claiming them as a dependent. If they don't want, there's like a personal exemption, so that's really the benefit of claiming a dependent, and then also for the earned income tax credit. If alternatively, they could also file on their own. Really, there's nothing really stopping them from doing that. Either the only thing I will say is that if the parents do claim them, then you have to make sure that the person being claimed hasn't provided more than half of their own support. So if the student has provided more than half of their own support, then the parents can't claim them. And then they can file a tax return, and they probably should file a tax return on them by themselves. And if they have earned income, they would probably be entitled to a refund and things like that. So I don't know does that address the question?
Yes. And then the last question regarding tax filing for those who file single but are married. how do they file taxes if they've just purchased a new home? So they aren't filing joint, they're filing single head of household.
Okay. Sorry, could you repeat that question one more time?
Yep, no problem. So the couple is filing single married head of household, not a joint filing status as you indicated, but just purchased a home together.
Okay. So if you're married, I believe you actually should not be using head of household. It would be the technicality of the law is that head of household is if you're single and you have dependents. So that's, I mean, if you're living together but you're not married, you could use head of household. But if you're married, you really should be either using married filing jointly or married filing separately. So that's kind of not the greatest answer. Sorry, but that is okay.
I'm sure they'll send some clarifying points if needed.
Awesome, thank you. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that's usually.
That was helpful. Thank you, Zara.
You're welcome, thank you. Before we go, I do also, so this is our contact information. We are still operating remotely, so we're doing remote intake through the phone. We actually just recently set up a web submission form. I don't have the information to our website on here, but if you go to, I believe it's, and Emily, you can chime in, it's ecbavlp.org is our website.
.com.
.com, there we go.
Yeah. ecbavlp.com.
.com. Perfect. Thank you. I don't know why I said all, but anyways, and there's actually a tab for the low-income taxpayer clinic, and you can put in, you can submit a web submission form with your contact information, and we can contact you that way as well. So that's how to get a hold of us. But sometimes people don't really want to talk to us, but we're more than happy to talk to everyone. So please, that was my sad attempt at being funny, but if you do have any tax questions in general, please do feel free to reach out to us. If we aren't able to assist you fully with your case, we can at least provide you with some consultation, whether that be some tax advice, or we can provide you with resources of people who can help you on a full representation basis. But yeah, so that's really my 2 cents on that. But usually during this time of the year, people are more concerned with free tax filing resources. And I highlight this because I know that last year was very challenging. VITA sites are a great resource for, I believe it's your income has to be below $54,000 annually. So if your income is below that, you can go to a VITA site. Usually, pre-COVID times, you could go to a VITA site and have your taxes prepared for free. This last year, VITA sites were closed for quite a while, but I believe that the infrastructure now is in place, where they're doing remote intakes and they are assisting people remotely. And some sites actually have a drive-through tax preparation sites. So the information is not available on the IRS's website just yet, but I believe by January 15th, if you go to the link indicated, there is a free tax preparation site locator, and that will have all of the information available. I know just because I do speak to one of the clinic directors, the Northwest Buffalo Community Center should be operating come January 15th. They are hoping to be operating in person. So if that's of any help to anybody. There are also some self-prepared tools available on the IRS's website that are also great. I mean, if you feel comfortable filing your own tax returns, you could also use the free file available through the IRS's website. So yeah, that's about it for me. But if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out or.
Thank you, Zara. And just a reminder to our community who's watching us live through Facebook, the links that you see today will be posted in the comments for you to access. And I'll also share with you again our hotline information for the VLP legal services. As Zara and Emily mentioned, there's a hotline for each one of the questions or issues that may be addressed or coming up from your families. A big thank you to Zara today for providing this valuable information. It was a lot of information related to tax filing, which we know is always a confusing time for families. And we just wanted to make sure that you were well prepared, especially with all the nuances with the COVID-19 pandemic happening this year. Again, if you do need additional advice for any other topics or have questions regarding the information shared today, please contact one of the numbers listed here for BLP. We have a strong partnership with them with SAS Buffalo and are grateful for the work that they continue to do with us in providing these resources to our community. And I'll just turn it back over to Zara and Emily in case they have anything else to share. And we look forward to seeing everyone for our next legal clinic session.
Thank you, Julina. That's all that I have to share. But if just feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. Thank you so much.